Good morning, son. I am a bird wearing a brown polyester shirt, and you've joined Sounds Good to Us. I'm Gregory Hill.
And I'm Jordan Stone.
This is a podcast where two friends for 20 years talk about one album per episode, go incredibly deep, incredibly detailed, and we talk about why we think it's awesome. You can follow us on Twitter and Instagram, and you can listen to us wherever you get podcasts. Let's stop talking, Jordan. Let's get started with today's album, Rockin the Suburbs by Ben Folds, one of our favorites. You want to get us kicked off with some general deets?
Yeah, let's do it. So Ben Folds, Rockin the Suburbs. For those who might not be aware, Ben Folds was the frontman for Ben Folds 5, where you may know his song Brick from the album Whatever and Ever Amen. That was maybe his biggest hit, arguably. This is his first solo album after leaving Ben Folds 5, and it was released on a very important day in history, September 11th. And not just September 11th, but September 11th, 2001.
Yeah.
So obviously on 9/11, that could have impacted the critical success of this album. We don't know, but we'll dive into a little bit of that. So pass it over to you, Greg, for sales and critical reception.
Yeah, so it's interesting to look at albums that you have a personal connection with and try to think about how it actually did. Was it popular? Was it not popular? What did people much smarter than us say about it? For these episodes, we're just going to pull from Metacritic. It could go different ways, but it averages reviews. It's similar to Rotten Tomatoes, if you're familiar with that. And so it aggregates from a bunch of different places and averages them together for like critical reviews as well as fan reviews. So for Metacritic, Rockin the Suburbs had a 75 out of 100. A solid C, I think, if you're using the school scale. Some of these reviews were mixed, but there were no negative reviews, even from critics. So there was no one saying straight up, this album sucks, but there were definitely some mixed reviews. The highest outlet was Entertainment Weekly, the review coming in at an 80 out of 100. And then Rolling Stone and Blender were the lowest, giving it a 60. I was actually surprised, Jordan. I think we'll probably have a reoccurring segment on this. What did Pitchfork think about it? Sort of the stand-in, hipster perspective. It was actually higher than Rolling Stone and Blender. I think, if I remember correctly, Pitchfork gave it like a 65. The user score, though, was an 8.7 out of 10. I don't know why Metacritic uses out of 10 for fans and out of 100 for reviews, but I guess that's a question for them. But these were only positive. Fans love this album. I think we'll talk about this a lot. This is a fan favorite album, even if the critical response was mixed. Fans love this album. Want to go through a couple things. I'm going to talk to you about two albums that were rated higher on Metacritic scale, meaning they got higher than a 75, and then two albums that were rated lower than a 75. And I want you to tell me if you think that the two albums that were rated higher are better and the two albums that were rated lower were worse. And let's just see how calibrated we are to Metacritic. So the first two,
let's do it.
White Blood Cells came in at an 86. So Metacritic aggregator believes is significantly better than Rockin the Suburbs. What do you think about that?
Yeah, the White Stripes. I mean, I'm going to say no, it's not better than this album. I think people want it to be better because it's the White Stripes and they're important to music and all of those things you can say about the White Stripes, but I really don't think it's better.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And what about the Blueprint coming in at 88 by Jay-Z? Also, by the way, these are all from 2001, so similar albums.
Yeah, same year. So Blueprint by Jay-Z, I'm going to say it's about the same. I don't think it's worse. I don't think it's better, but I think it's fair to say they're about the same on even playing field.
Okay. And then let's talk about a couple albums that Metacritic's aggregator rated as lower. One is the album 2001 Weezer, which fans call the Green Album. That came in as a 73, so around the same as Rockin the Suburb. Do you think this album is worse than Rockin the Suburbs?
I don't think it's worse. I think it might be the same. I love that album. Pop rock. They fall really in the same genre, and that might be Weezer's poppiest album. Maybe it is a little worse or the same.
Okay, and then significantly worse, according to the scale, Drops of Jupiter by Train.
An album with a few really, really good songs and huge hits, but the rest are throwaway tracks to me. So no, it is not better.
Okay, so we're thinking 75 seems pretty fair so far. Although you probably would have rated it higher out of 75. We'll
I
talk about
would.
the rating later. Okay. I want to give two quotes from my research here. One was my favorite quote from a critic was from the Pitchfork article saying, "For that at least, it beats the shit out of Beethoven." I just like to think that Ben Folds is sitting somewhere and has a personal grudge against Beethoven as a pianist from a different era,
Yeah.
and likes to be compared to Beethoven, and also
Yes.
in this beats the shit out of him. And then my favorite user review quote: "Intelligent pop rock in an unintelligent era. Stupid people will hate it." I think it's a pretty great way to talk about it.
Love it.
All right, so I'm going to quickly get through some general information about the album before we get into our segments about song tracks. One thing that stood out immediately was Ben Folds was 35 when this album came out, which is exactly the same age that Jordan and I are now. Strange to think about this. I know that in
Yeah, it is.
2001, when I was listening to this album, I didn't think about Ben Folds being 35 years old and being young. I thought about him being very old at 35, and now we're
Yep.
35, which means we're old if you use transitive property. So, fuck. Yeah. The genre, alternative rock. Uh, I think one thing, Jordan, is this time period is probably the height of alternative rock as far as the popular consciousness goes. Do you agree with that?
Yeah. Yes, I do.
What are some other alternative rock bands from this era?
Well, first of all, I don't want to get too much into this right now, but I don't
Sure.
even know if this is alternative rock.
Mm,
Talking to friends and family about this album this past week, everyone said pop rock.
hmm
And to call it alternative, I don't know if that's even accurate, especially a song like Rockin the Suburbs, which is just a straight pop song to me.
hmm
Um, but this falls, I think, in that era of, the Strokes and the Killers. That's what I think of when I think of that era and alt rock. And this album, it doesn't even fit in with those.
hmm
So alternative rock, I think they just gave it that genre just to give it something. But
hmm
really, it's if you're listening and this album you haven't heard very much, it is a pop rock album, really.
Got it. And I think your comparison to Weezer in this era
Yeah,
is
Weezer for sure.
appropriate. So in that case, do you think Weezer would be labeled alternative rock in your mind?
Most of their albums, like Pinkerton, yes. The Green
hmm
album, no.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, depends on which Weezer we're talking about.
Yeah. I think from some of the research, what you're saying, I think was even intentional by, can we call Ben by his first name or do we say Mr. Folds? What do we say here?
Let's
This
call
is
let's
new
call
church.
him Ben.
All right.
He
So
lives in
I,
Nashville. We can call him
I
Ben.
think, I think what Ben was trying to do here is he said, quote, "I wanted to make a pop album. And I wanted to make every song 3 to 4 minutes with great choruses, and I wanted to make 12 of them." So
Yep.
I think that's pretty much where he was. The length of the album comes in at 48 minutes and 42 seconds. They said there were 12 songs in the album, but there was a 13th only released in the Japanese version that was called Hiro, Hiro. I think it's a fantastic song. I actually would replace one song with that song in this album if it was released again in the US. And Ben actually says that it was one of his favorites. It was released on the Epic label. Ben Folds produced it, so did Ben Gross. Ben Gross, I don't know how many producer nerds there are out there, but at this period of time, Ben Gross had a lot of artists that he was working with, from Dream Theater, Marilyn Manson, Seven Dust, 30 Seconds to Mars. A lot of bands that are much, much different than Ben Folds, which I think is interesting. But I think that comes out, especially in Rockin the Suburbs, which I think you'll get to, is such a different song than the rest of the album.
Yeah.
It was recorded in a church in Adelaide, Australia, which is interesting. I think you're going to talk about here in a sec. It peaked at 42 on the Billboard 200, so never really got that high as far as radio play, but it was number 11 on the top internet albums. Which, as I read that, it was difficult for me to think what an internet album was in 2001, pre streaming, pre iTunes. I actually don't know anything about how they got there. But it's clear to me that, again, like we talked about with fans, I think this album had much more fan legs than it did any sort of mainstream airplay.
Yes.
Ben wrote every song on the album except for Losing Lisa. He co-wrote with Fraley Hines. And a couple words I want to say here to see if you agree with this. As far as the mood of the album goes, ironic, bittersweet, warm, nostalgic, witty, and literate. What do you think
Yeah.
about that?
Um, yeah, for sure. It's like picking out the tasting notes in a glass of wine, right?
I
Like, I
like that.
mean,
Yeah.
someone just picked these words at random, I feel like.
Yeah.
Just so I think it depends on the person, but I do think it's a good way to describe the album. Yeah, I mean, it's what I love about the album. I think earnest is the word that I would go with the most here. He really is true in his writing, and this album
hmm
is true Ben Folds.
Yeah.
It's writing from the heart, it's personal experience.
hmm
And when you listen to, especially to a song like Fred Jones Part Two, you
hmm
can feel the characters. It's just a very, very well written album.
Yeah. I like the wine notes. There was black currant, leather, tobacco, and so
Yes,
a good deal of minerality.
yes.
Yeah, I like it. Cool. And then just some influences. We'll talk a little bit about what we think this album influenced, but publicly, at least in some of the reviews, people have said Billy Joel. I think obviously, although when asked directly about Billy Joel, Ben Folds says that he doesn't really listen to Billy Joel, which sort of surprises me a little bit. But Ben Folds has said directly that Joe Jackson, Todd Rundgren directly influenced the music that Ben Folds wants to create. And then when asked about Burt Bacharach, he called Burt Bacharach a genius and definitely had an influence on the songwriting. So that does it for sort of the intro to the album. You want to get to some fun facts, Jordan, before we get into the songs?
Yeah, let's do it. Some fun facts you may not know about Rockin the Suburbs. There's not a lot out there, but I found a few fun ones. Some of these songs were re-recorded for a children's animated movie called Over the Hedge,
Mm-hmm.
which you may not know or realize. And what's weird is they were re-recorded with different lyrics. So Rockin the Suburbs was completely redone by Ben with different lyrics. I wouldn't recommend it. Don't ruin the song. Go listen to the album first. Um, John McCrae is the guest spot on Fred Jones Part Two. So if you go listen to Fred Jones Part Two, you will notice there are two different male vocals on the chorus in that song. And John McCrae, the lead singer of Cake, very famous band from the 90s, is a guest spot on that in the background vocals. Fred Jones Part Two. It is called Part Two because, yes, it is a sequel. And it is a sequel to a Ben Folds 5 song called Cigarette from Whatever and Ever Amen. Go listen to Cigarette and then listen to Fred Jones Part Two to get the full story. Rockin the Suburbs. What is he talking about in that song? He's making fun of Korn, the band. He has said this publicly. So when he wrote that song, he was like, I'm going to write this song about people who grew up in the suburbs and their life is so hard and terrible. And obviously they go on Korn to make a rock band that, is known for complaining about their life and how much it sucks or whatever. He originally named Korn in the song, like called them out, but decided
Mm-hmm.
to omit that part, which I think was a good idea.
Yeah, I agree.
And yeah, and last but not least, this is an interesting one. A fan theory right now is The Ascent of Stan is a song on the album, and people think it's a continuation of a book called The Descent of Man by Charles Darwin. So Ascent of Stan, Descent of Man. The book is evolutionary theory of humans, and so this people think this is the 21st century version of that book. So a man, working in an office, all the things that you go and you work in an office today. Anyway, that's a fan theory, and that's my last fun fact for the album.
Cool. Yeah, as a Cake fan, it amazed me that John McCrae was on Fred Jones Part Two. I didn't know that until you brought it up. And
Yeah,
plus one on Cigarette, it's a great song. I think when I first heard this album, I didn't make that connection, and I just thought the Part Two was a joke. But
yeah,
it's cool to know that. And then I agree. Calling out another artist, especially another artist that was making music at that point of time,
yeah,
probably would have been a bad call. And this allows them to generalize to other bands. I think you kind of fill in the blank. Is it Korn? Is it Limp Bizkit? Whatever suburban rock music that was coming out of this time. So,
yeah.
um, so let's get into next. I think just a couple personal connections to the album. This album is really important to both of us. Usually we're going to pick albums that we have some kind of a connection to or a story with. The goal here isn't to, create a top 10 objective list of the best albums of all time. So why don't just tell me a little bit about what comes to mind when you think about this album? Do you have any personal stories that are sort of triggered by just going down the path of listening to Rockin the Suburbs?
I do. I have a few, and I'm going to go in chronological order. Back to this album being released on September 11th, 2001. Obviously, a day that lives in infamy. We all remember where we were. Greg and I were sophomores in high school, went to high school together, so we were in the same building on that day. I'll never forget the day, obviously, and then getting home from school. And Greg and I had been waiting for this album to come out. And, the world is crumbling around us.
Yeah.
And we couldn't drive at this time. So I still asked my dad to take me to Best Buy and buy this album, which is
That's
just funny,
right there. Yeah.
It's commitment, but like I'm 15 years old. I don't have perspective in the world, right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what's going on. So my dad, decides to take me. So we go to Best Buy and get the album, and I'll never forget that part of this. That day for this album. Next is I then go to college, and my group of friends, we would host parties. And for some reason, I didn't do this. It was my other friends who I didn't know were Ben Folds fans. They started playing Annie Waits at every party. So it would come on, and the intro has clapping to it, and all of us would clap along. So just that is weird. It wasn't a single. People would start to learn that song as they hung out with us, which was cool. So that kind of had an impact on my college partying experience, which is weird to think about. And then also in college at LSU, I drove to Houston to see Ben in concert. And I'm at the concert. And for those listening, I grew up in Nashville, like we've mentioned, and lived here. And so Ben Folds moved here probably in the late 90s or something like that. Well, anyway, he lives on a street called Belmont Boulevard, or lived, I should say. I shouldn't say where he lives. I don't know that. But he lived on a street called Belmont Boulevard.
I'm gonna edit all of this out.
And I knew that, right? I knew where he lived. And so in between songs, I go, Belmont Boulevard, Belmont Boulevard. I don't know why I did this. Don't ask me why. But I wanted to just call out his street name while there was silence between songs. I'm sure he thought I was insane.
Oh yeah, I'm sure he moved pretty shortly after that. Increased security presence at his compound.
He absolutely did. So that's another funny this album, the Ben Folds story for me. What about you on the personal?
Well, I want to talk about that story a little bit. So okay. Number one is you drove from Baton Rouge to Houston. Were you alone?
No.
Did you go by yourself? Okay.
The friend.
So that would have been even funnier if it's just a dude in the pit,
just by himself.
That
guy by himself yelling out my address.
Yeah. Secondly, what did the other person you were with do? Were they like, man, why are you yelling out? What was that like? Do you remember that?
They didn't know why I was, to be honest, like they didn't have the story or the backgrounds. They were very confused. I had to explain it afterwards.
Yeah, it would have been funny if they join in, everyone in the crowd joins in.
Yeah.
And then my third is I kind of have a fantasy of this in general with celebrity stories, is that does Ben Folds ever tell that story? Or I guess the over or under on the number of times that Ben Folds has told that story to a friend, like, man, I was playing this show in Houston and this crazy guy kept yelling out my address.
I'm taking over 0.
Okay.
I think like at least that night he's on the phone with his wife or talking to someone who tours with him. He had to have been like, what's up with the dude, yelling my address out during the show in Houston, by the way, 1,000 miles away.
I love it. Thanks for sharing those. Yeah. My story, we bought this album together. I don't exactly remember. It was some time probably later on that weekend. I don't know who would have driven us because, like you said, we couldn't have driven at that point. So I bought that album a little bit after you did. We bought it together at the same Best Buy. I'm sure where you bought it. It was sort of the closest place to buy music to where we grew up. But I had the CD, and then a couple years later, the iPod comes out, burn my entire CD collection onto my computer, and then I'm able to get those onto the iPod. But I also had at that point a CD player in my truck, and I had probably 500 CDs. You remember those big books that had all the
Yeah.
little slots for them? And somebody broke into my truck and stole all of my CDs, which was one of the worst things. I mean, talk about being in the suburbs and not having anything bad ever happen to you. It was just such a punch in the gut because I just had spent so much time building up that album collection. So I at least I had them on my computer so I could burn some CDs because at that point I didn't have an aux cord to pass around for the truck. So I did burn the CD, but somehow when I burned it, I burned it in the wrong order. And so, for example, the first song on the album was like the fifth song, and the last song was
Yeah.
the second or whatever. So it was almost like the Gregory cut or the Greg cut the edit of this album. And I wasn't until I got Spotify that I realized that I'd been listening to this album a lot in completely the wrong order. So that was my experience for probably a decade with this album.
Yep. Very nice.
Okay, so let's then just talk about, to get us started, what are just some general impressions you have of the album? How do you think about the album, how it sounds, how it's constructed, how it's written?
Yeah, the first word that comes to mind for me is comfortable. I know this album front to back. I know every song front to back, every lyric, every word. And
Mm-hmm.
every time I listen to it, it's not taking effort. I don't have to listen to it. Like I can listen passively and I still am absorbing it. I like to describe it as like an old hoodie, like your favorite hoodie. It's soft. You've washed it 1,000 times. Every time you put that hoodie on, you're just comfortable. That's
Mm-hmm.
how this album is for me. And I don't have a lot of albums that are that way to me.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just an amazing, comfortable album for me that I'm so comfortable listening to. And whenever I put it on, it just feels right, like that old hoodie I was mentioning.
Yeah, I like that. I like that way to describe it. Pretty similar for me. I think it's a beautiful album. I think there's, as much as the critical consensus at the time, I think, was that it was funny. You almost have some reviewers talk about it like it's a shadow comedy album, which
Yeah.
there are some parts that are funny. I think a lot of other people talk about this being a transition for Ben from being in Ben Folds 5, making music that's like light and immature and sophomorish, and then gets into sort of, again, he's 35 here. He's writing music that's more reflective. He's writing music that, I mean, obviously Brick almost 10 years before was an incredibly deep song, but I think the tracks are well written. I like music that is specific. We'll talk about songs like Losing Lisa, has sort of anecdotes that are very particular to his relationships, but
Yeah.
I can still identify with them in my relationships that I've had. So that's one. I think the songwriting is good. I think it's beautiful in parts. I think it's well produced. I think it sounds good. There's not track. We'll talk a little bit about some tracks that I don't love the tonality of, but overall, I love this album. I would say if I had to make a list of the top 50 albums in my life, not what I consider the best, just to be my top 50 favorite albums, this is definitely in the top 50.
Absolutely.
And it's probably one of the top 20 albums I've listened to the most. If I had sort of Spotify's metrics going back to when the day I was born, and I could track how many times I listened to music across every format, this would be probably in the top 10 or top 20
Yeah.
for sure.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the cover art. This one I think might be a little bit more disagreeable for us. What do you think about the cover art?
Yeah, definitely album art. The cover of an album is completely subjective to me.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think there's any rules with album art. It can be anything in the world you can think of. It doesn't even need to have your band's name on it or even the name of the album. It can just be a picture, right?
Mm-hmm.
When I see this cover, though, I love it. I love the simplicity. I love that it's black and white, minus, the photo itself, it's black and white at least. It reminds me of Tapestry by Carole King, which is one
Mm-hmm.
of my favorite covers, if not my favorite album cover of all time. I really love the casual, unposed album cover where the person just seems to be living their life, hanging out in their house, and a camera takes a picture. So for me, I love it. It's simple and reminds me of my favorite album cover, Tapestry.
Yeah, to your point about subjectivity, I mean, I don't think you're wrong. I really don't like it. As I, again, like anything, when we talked about this question, wanted to talk about it on the podcast, I stared at it for like 10 minutes and thought about the front of the album for the first time that I probably had in my entire life.
Yeah.
And as I analyzed it, I just really don't like it. I get the opposite impression. It sort of has a moody, self-aware, I'm now the solo artist. This song, I mean, we talked about the how this album is reflective and thoughtful, and it just, to me, it seemed a little bit overdone, even though it's a very simple shot. Those of you who can sort of look at the album cover right now. I understand it's a podcast, so you can't see it right now. I don't like the front feel, like the glass in the front is distracting. I don't like V-neck t-shirts, so that's another shot against the album cover. I don't like V-neck t-shirts, and so he's wearing a V-neck t-shirt that makes it hard for me to get behind the cover. So but I can't hold that against the album.
I just noticed the glass of water is full. Maybe, just maybe, he's alluding to the fact that his life is full now that he's a solo artist and he's happy. That we could dive into some theories.
But that's like, I think that's the question is, I think you look at that album cover and you're like, this is a candid shot. I look at the album cover and I don't see it as a candid shot. Like, to me, they took multiple ones and they told Ben to sit in a certain way, and they had the glass. Were they thinking about the glass? Is that intentional? I would almost rather have, something that was so clearly intentionally designed. But yeah, water makes sense.
Yeah.
And you assume it's water. It could be any sort of clear liquor, but you're assuming it's water.
It could. If it was vodka with no ice filled to the top, I hope Ben's doing okay now. It's been 20 years, but
the water comment reminds me of, have you seen the meme online where it says, I'm half full, I'm half empty, and I'm piss? Have you seen that?
Yeah.
Pretty good. All right. So that gets us through sort of just the top end. Let's dive more deeply. Let's talk about the songs themselves. We're going to get to things like what we think the best deep track is, what songs we can put on repeat, what we want to play at our wedding, we want to play at our funeral, and so on and so forth. Do you want to get us started, Jordan? What do you think the best deep track is? And can you tell me a little bit about, on an album like this, where there's only one charting single, what is a deep track?
Yeah, deep track to me, I didn't look up the definition, so I'll just give you mine. I think it can't be a hit. I also don't think it can be the first song on the album. Because back in the day, if you put an LP on, you put a tape on, you put a CD on, you're playing it from the first track, and you have to typically purposely, especially a CD, purposely move it to another track, right? Like track forward. So calling something a deep track comes from that, is you had to physically push a button or move a needle to get deeper into the album. So it can't be the first track. I think philosophically, it can't be a hit. You're not going to call Stairway to Heaven a deep track on Led Zeppelin's 4. That's kind of the rules, I think. And it is a segue, obviously, into what I think the best deep track is. But also, I think you might disagree a little bit on this being a deep track. Not the same is the song. And it's a massive fan hit. In the Ben Folds fan community, it's a hit. Everyone knows it. Everyone can sing along to it, all those things. But in the general world of things with deep track, I'm going to say not the same. It's probably the best song on the album. Honestly, I'd probably pick it out as the best song. Again, it's huge in the fandom of Ben Folds, and it's my favorite song on the album. But I also consider it Ascent of Stan. I think that is my next favorite deep track on the album.
Yeah, I do think it's hard for me to consider. I agree with your rules, and so I think not the same fits those criteria. But you and I have been to probably a dozen Ben Folds shows in every type of venue, and he plays
Yeah.
not the same almost everywhere. And I think one of the interesting things about this album is that we were talking about before the pod, I guess as they say, is that there's almost an extended universe. I've been watching WandaVision recently, so I'm thinking about the Marvel extended universe. And I think there's a extended universe for Ben Folds 5 and Ben Folds in which someone like Robert Sledge shows up in the universe of a Ben Folds album, who was a member of Ben Folds 5. If you've listened to Not the Same, and Jordan, you can probably go through the story of Not the Same. It would probably be interesting for people who haven't heard it. But so to me, because it's played at every single concert I've seen him, I don't think I've ever not heard him play it. It's on multiple of his albums. Ben Folds has released a couple live albums, and it makes its way onto a couple of those. So it's hard for me to call it a deep track in the context of Ben Folds-ness, but agree that
Yeah.
it's not necessarily a hit on any other circumstances. So, and it's a great song. I mean,
Right.
it's a fantastic song. Mine is Losing Lisa. I think to me this reminds me a lot of Ben Folds' 5 song. There's obviously sort of he's in a transition here, so there's a couple that are really stark, just him playing piano, like you'll hear in his EPs that come a couple years after this album, and some are more full, trio productions with bass and drums and piano. But Losing Lisa, I think it's one of the best written songs on the album. I talked about earlier how I like albums that the wording and the choices the songwriter makes are very specific. But even though they're specific to that relationship, it still sort of reminds me of relationships that I have, especially with breakups, which my favorite subgenre of music is breakup music. Even if I'm happy in a relationship, I still listen to breakup songs. But so Losing Lisa for me, I think is the best deep track. But I would listen to Not the Same probably more than Losing Lisa. Do you want to quick tell the story of Not the Same, just for people who haven't heard it?
Yeah, and I don't know it as much as a Ben Folds super fan would, and someone might correct me on a few things here. And in fact, there's another fun fact I didn't bring up. So this song is about, I believe he was living in Nashville at the time, and one of his friends who was British, they're having a going away party for him. And in the song, he says it's at Robert Sledge's house. Robert Sledge is the bassist for Ben Folds 5. And the fun fact is that it wasn't Robert Sledge's house. That Ben said it's Robert Sledge's house because it sounded better in the lyrics. So he replaced the name in the lyrics. And the story is something like they gave this guy like 3 going away parties for some reason. Like they just kept staying and he wouldn't leave. So they're like, yay, so-and-so's going away. Let's have a going away party. And then it's like a few weeks later and the guy still hasn't left town.
Yeah.
So they do another party. Yeah. So that's the gist.
There's also a song, was it Steven's Last Night in Town? I think that he references that guy and Not the Same. The story that I always heard is that somebody took LSD and I don't actually know who it was. And this is where, listeners can send us messages on Twitter about how.
Wait, did I get the stories mixed up?
I'm trying to navigate out of that gracefully, but yes, you did. That's fine. It doesn't matter.
Damn it!
No,
I ignore everything I said.
Is Steven's Last Night in Town, but maybe it's the same party again. There's an unreliable narrator situation here. If he's already lying about Robert Sledge, but in this song he says, at Robert Sledge's party. And then the person took LSD, climbed up into a tree, and then, as he says explicitly in the song, sort of found Jesus and came down and was just completely different. And that's you were not the same after that. So, I think this segment certainly shows the research integrity that we have.
I mean, if you're a big fan of Ben Folds 5 and you want to go listen to Steven's Last Night in Town, now you know what it's about.
Yeah, or if you want to stop listening after this, or tweet your friends and say we don't know what we're talking about. Yeah,
Yeah,
let's
that's good
transition
publicity
into
for us.
something else here and talk about what song can you just put on repeat, listen to it over and over again, um, and you wouldn't get sick of it.
Yeah, so I also think of this as, let's say there's a listener right now and
Hmm.
they've never heard any of this album. What song should they go listen to first? I would say it's the same as
Hmm.
my repeat one, Zach and Sarah. So Zach and Sarah is a really fun, upbeat song. It's also the shortest song on the album. So, you're not asking someone to listen to a 5 or 6 minute song as their first song. And it also makes it repeatable. So Zach and Sarah, I think easily is
Mine
my
is
answer
actually the
for
same
this.
too, and I was curious thinking about this. Why we talked about earlier how "Rockin the Suburbs" was the only charting single on this album. I'm sort of surprised when I think about the landscape of the top, like Billboard Top 100 of this period of time. And I'm surprised in 2001, Zach and Sarah didn't chart. I don't know if they just didn't, you know, Epic is, Epic is, you wouldn't consider Epic to be an indie label, right? But it's not a massive label. But I'm just
No,
surprised that this wasn't on the radio. I think it's a much better song than Rockin' the Suburbs.
yeah,
And I think it's poppy and fun.
yes, it
And
is.
to give an example of kind of what you're talking about, I was playing this album when we were driving somewhere, and this song came on, and my girlfriend sort of immediately started dancing. It's a very poppy song for her. I could listen to it over and over again. It's easy to sing. It's easy to sort of move around to, and then it's
Yeah,
interactive. You had the clapping you were talking about earlier, so I think it has everything I want in a pop song. What do you think
yeah.
the worst song of the album is? Just straight up, I don't think we either think that there's a bad album or a bad song on this album, but what do you think the worst is?
Yeah, I definitely don't think there's a bad song, but
Mm-hmm.
if I have to pick, I'd say Fired. It sounds like a
Mm-hmm.
Ben Folds 5 cast off song, like a B-side, a song that Ben Folds 5 just never really released or something. And he just stuck it in at the end of this album and was like, I'll just add it in so that there's 12 songs or whatever, however many tracks there are in this album. So it doesn't do much for me. It's okay. But I don't even think it really fits. I hear it and I think Ben Folds 5. I don't think Ben Folds.
There were
So
two that I was
Fired is
thinking
my answer
about,
for
and
worst
Fired
song.
was one of them. I landed on the Ascena Stand, which I know you like a lot. There's portions of this song that I love, but
Yeah.
I really don't like the chorus. The verses are fine, but there's these parts that his voice goes into, which I actually love Ben Folds' voice. It's if you hear him live, he'll do everything in ranges from very low jazzy stuff all the way to covering the darknesses. I believe in a thing called love, and can sing like a falsetto and get into his head voice really high. But there's parts of whether the key, I'm not a musician, but like the key that it's in, and there's parts of the song I just don't like. So if I was listening to the album and I put play on track one and I was driving around or I had the ability to skip, when it came to this song, I'd probably skip it, but I would probably also skip Fired. All right, let's get into
Fair enough.
if either of us had sort of the autonomy to, or let's say you're sitting down with your significant other, you're getting married, and you're saying, okay, what do we want our first song to be, our first dance? Are there any songs in this album that you would consider for that?
Yeah. So
Yeah.
my first dance wedding song is easily The Luckiest. I don't even think it's close. And this song, I know I'm sure we'll talk about this, but this song
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
became to me the like hipster first dance song. If you went to a small liberal arts college in the mid 2000s, you probably and got married,
Mm-hmm,
you probably had The Luckiest as your first dance song. And I
mm-hmm.
don't blame you. It's a great song. It's a great love song. And if I'm choosing a song from
Yeah,
this album, it's
I agree. I think
unquestionably The
it's the
Luckiest.
obvious choice in that I'm sure if we were to do 100 albums, not every single one of them would have a song that we'd want to play at our wedding. Like, if we eventually did Doggy Style by Snoop Dogg, E Dog, I don't think there's one on there. We'd probably be like, yeah, this is going to be great. But the luckiest is tailor made. It's a love song. It's sweet. It's beautifully written. Um, I actually found I think a resource that we'll use frequently on this podcast called First Dance Charlotte. and she reviews this blog. She reviews songs and whether or not they make good first dance songs. And she had an article on The Luckiest, and
Yeah.
she does recommend it. She considers it to be a good first dance song. The only con, she says, but I then agree with her sentiment, is the song does talk about death, right? They grow old together and die, and her contention is
Yeah.
some people will find that to be off-putting, but she personally finds it to be very romantic, and I agree. I think you're sitting at a wedding. At that point, you assume that you'll be married forever and you'll grow old and die together. The song tells that story. So I think Luckiest
Yeah.
is fantastic.
Yeah.
The only other option I had,
It
just
does.
because I knew that Luckiest would be both of our choice, if I was in sort of a quirky mid-2000s relationship with like a Zoe Deschanel type person, maybe we do like a choreographed YouTube viral video
Yeah.
to Zach and Sarah with the claps, and everything else. But I think
Yeah.
Luckiest is the way to go.
Yeah, I can see that. Yep.
All right, so let's, we talked about life. Let's talk about death. Is there a song on this album that you would request to be played at your funeral?
If it's asked that way,
okay, so let's say you have to pick a song. What song do you have to pick from this album for your funeral?
Yeah, so Fred Jones Part 2.
Really
and
depressing.
I know, depressing. Fred Jones Part 2 is a depressing song. It doesn't matter how you, like, what way you look at it. A friend of mine who's a lot younger than us just heard this song this week for the first time and was texting me about it. And he was like, that is one of the most visual songs. I can see this guy in his basement projecting slides onto the wall, and all that. And so, it's sad, I know, but just when I think funeral, I think sad songs. And, I don't want my life to end that way that Fred Jones's did. So I think I really just picked a song because I had to. So Fred Jones
we'll
Part
end
2
up
for
talking about this a lot in this category, but at this point, you're dead, right? They could play, Duran Duran or,
anything.
Faces or something. The music is there for the people that are attending your funeral for the most part. I think this song would be so bone-crushingly depressing for. Yeah, because
people
and by the way, not in like a
their eyes out.
reflective, sort of beautiful sadness that in the grieving process. Basically, what you're saying when you play this song is that you are Fred Jones and you're just sort of a depressed, sad person, and then
It would make my funeral even worse. You're already there for, this guy you knew who died.
Yeah.
And now you got to listen to this depressing song. It would be a shitty funeral.
But, in that case, mine was Still Fighting It, which is one of my favorite songs on the album. This song is also sad. It talks about the types of themes that you would assume to be present at a funeral for the more spiritually and religiously inclined people. It sort of has those types of themes: optimism, grace, growth, etc. And then it ends on a hopeful note, right? Basically, the song is about it sucks to get older, but everybody does, and you don't really have any control over it. So what are we going to do with the time that we have? And so I think I would want people to leave my funeral thinking, well, now I need to go do something great or impactful or kind to someone. And I hope that this song would send them sort of in a positive bias leaving my funeral.
Yeah.
So unlike yours, which would make them go to a fast food place and sit in their basement and cry. Yeah. Okay. All right. Yes, last one. Let's talk about this. You're a huge Post Malone fan, and I think Post Malone is, from what I've heard you say, being an incredibly underrated artist, not just a pop musician. So I think he also has the ability to play across multiple genres, and both of us would be curious what a lot of songs would sound like if he covered them. So our last category here is there a song on the album that could be covered effectively by Post Malone? And if you think so, which one would you want him to cover?
Yep. So two of my favorite Post Malone
Hmm.
songs are slower. They feature him on
Hmm.
guitar. They're not even really hip hop songs. They're just singer songwriter, and they're called "Stay" and "Feeling Whitney." And so when I think of those two songs, I can
Hmm.
see Post Malone doing "Still Fighting It." I'd love to hear him cover it. It's a really well written song. You just touched on it a lot, and I think Post Malone
Okay.
could do it justice. So "Still Fighting
I
It" is
don't
my
think there's a
answer.
wrong answer here. I think that's a great one. I would do, you already talked about Fred Jones Part Two. I would just like a really sort of dark, quiet, slow version of that song in which he's sort of singing it in parts, talk rapping it in others, a pretty sparse
Yeah.
mix. I think he could make it even more depressing than the recording is. So I would like to see him take that song over. And
Yeah.
this is topical, right? This week, as we record the album in February of 2021, Post Malone, I think it's the only cover song he's released, right? Was I Only Want to Be With You by Hootie and the Blowfish.
Uh,
Yeah.
Released as in like a studio recording, I believe so. But
Hmm.
if anyone's curious, if you're
Hmm.
listening, go to YouTube and type in Post Malone Nirvana. I this is a Ben Folds podcast, at least this episode I know, but I wish Post Malone would
Hmm.
tour with Nirvana,
Mm.
the surviving members,
Interesting.
obviously, and be the singer.
Interesting.
I
All
think
right.
it would
All
be
right. All
incredible.
right.
That's how good
Any
he
of the
is.
Post Malone
Yeah.
super fans out there, give us your ideas. Let's wrap this up. Let's talk about some final thoughts and get out of here. What What do you think the legacy for this album is? And I'll ask it in two ways. We talked a little bit about the personal legacy of the album for you and your personal connections to it. But in this case, what do you think the legacy is for the culture in general, for music in general, for pop culture? Does this album have a legacy? Do people still think about it? Has it been forgotten about? What do you think the legacy is here?
Yeah, and just to so I don't sound too
Hmm.
somber on this, we're going to talk about what this album has inspired in the next section here. But I don't think personally this album
Hmm.
has a legacy, and I think that's okay. I don't think every
Hmm.
album or piece of art, for that matter, needs a
Hmm.
legacy. It can just be a really good piece of art. And that's what this album is. It has fans, it has super fans, it has people like you and me that know every word to every song, but I don't think it has a place in pop culture history. I don't think any of the songs really made an impact in pop culture history. But it's one of those solid albums and it has its place, but I don't really think it had that major
Hmm.
impact to call it a legacy. And I don't think it'll make any lists, like Rolling Stone, top 250
Hmm.
albums of all time. I really don't think it'd make one of those lists. And that's okay.
I'm in
It's
a
just a
similar
great
spot,
album. What do you think?
unfortunately. I mean, we've talked so much about what this album means to us. And like you said, you know, Ben Folds has a very passionate fan base. I think Ben Folds, whether it's this album or most of his stuff after Ben Folds 5, which I think Ben Folds 5 probably had a more popular moment. I think I should have, but I didn't look through the sales or the charting of the Ben Folds 5 albums. But I just assume that the singles off those albums did better in airplay. Obviously, Brick was a bigger success than any of these songs in this album. So I don't think this is the
Yeah,
peak of Ben Folds' career if people look back on it. But if you go to a Ben Folds show, people are there for him and his solo music, I would contend, much more than they are for the Ben Folds 5 stuff. Two reasons. One is there's just more of it, right? There's just now,
I
people
agree.
always talk about Ben Folds, the former member of Ben Folds 5. There were only three
Yeah,
Ben Folds studio albums, and Ben Folds has had a career now of 20 years after this album has come out. So I think he has a passionate fan base, and the question is, what kind of career would you rather have? Would you rather have a Ben Folds career where you can live on Belmont Boulevard in Nashville and have some guy yell at you from the front above the audience, and but then be able to
yeah.
move and live in different countries
Good
and
aspirations.
maybe not have the same peak success of a Strokes talk about this time period, and maybe not even the critical
Yeah,
influence that a band like the Strokes would have. But I think I think Ben Folds fans love him more, and I think he
yep,
has a deeply more engaged and passionate audience. That's a pretty great legacy for me. I think if I'm him, I'd be overjoyed to have that
I
instead
agree.
of maybe having a shorter career that burned out a little earlier. Let's talk about
Agreed.
inspirations. I really struggled with this to your point about legacy. I don't know what other albums this necessarily inspired. Do you have any ideas who listened to this album was like, oh, I'm going to start making music like this?
Yeah, I don't know about this album specifically, but Ben Folds as a whole, I think,
Hmm.
is inspires pianist lead singers, right? So it's not
Hmm.
common in the history of music for the lead singer to play piano. You've got Coldplay is an obvious one. And in fact, I Googled best piano rock bands of all time,
Hmm.
and Ben Folds was number
Interesting.
five,
Yeah.
and Ben Folds five was number six. So it
Hmm.
shows his impact in, and by the way, there's
Yeah.
more than you think. So that the list isn't only six long, um, but he really does have an impact when it comes to piano and music. And I do think this album and Ben around that time frame really set
Hmm.
up bands and artists like The Fray, Sarah Bareilles, Vanessa Carlton, Five for Fighting. Bands like that where the piano was front and center in pop sort of rock singer songwriter. So when I think of Ben Folds and his legacy in this album, I think of those type bands and artists from the mid to late
Hmm.
2000s that had to be
Yeah. I
inspired
also
by Ben
wonder if
Folds
there's
on
an
some level.
inspiration. I think a lot of the bands that you talked about, and we talked about indie rock at its heights when you have bands like the White Stripes, the Strokes that are just massively popular. It's now possible to be an artist, especially with Spotify, where you're going to make most of your money off of touring and merchandise anyway. It behooves you to have a deeper audience rather than a wider audience, right? And you might not become a multi millionaire making your music, but you have a bunch of people who care, and you have enough to more than
Yep.
money than you need, right? So I wonder if he also, I'd be curious of talking to people who are probably more ingratiated into the business side of things than we are. What kind of impact someone like Ben Folds had on the business side? You remember after this, he just started sort of recording songs. He made a bunch of EPs. He would do a lot of covers. He would try a lot of different things out. He started playing with symphony orchestras. I just
Yeah.
he comes across as sort of more of an artist, and I wonder if that inspired other people to say, "Hey, I don't have to just go make a pop record that's going to get a lot of airplay, but I can make music that makes me really happy and find an audience that does that." I'm sure that that had to have made an impact on
Yeah.
some folks too, because I can't think of a lot of other artists who did that at this level of popularity as Ben did. Um,
No.
cool. So
No, for sure.
let's last thing here. Let's try to get a rating. I think you have a scale. Do you want to talk us through your scale and why it works the way it does?
Yeah. So we're gonna rate albums on a scale of 1 to 10, and to make it more specific, we're not gonna be able to pick the number seven. I don't think seven should be allowed because I think it's a cop out. If you think about the difference between 6 and 8 out of 10 is a huge difference, right? Six leans towards I don't like it, and eight leads towards it's really good. So let's not use the
Hmm.
number seven. So it's 1 to 10. You can't pick seven.
Hmm.
Um, so I thought about this two ways. In the general scope of music, so the history of all music that's ever been recorded, it's an 8 out of 10 to me. If you're in relation to other music, for me personally, this album is a 9.5 out of 10. It's near perfect. I love everything about it. I don't know how it could get any better.
Yeah.
Maybe a Beatles album is a 10 for me, or Pink Floyd or something like that. But as far as this album, 9.5, I think is as high as it can get. That's its ceiling for me personally. So 8 out of 10 in general scope of music,
I think it's
nine and a
interesting that
half
you can't
out
choose
of
seven,
10
but you
for
can
me.
choose a half. So I'm gonna force you to go 10 or 9. Which one
Yes,
is it?
absolutely.
Okay. I
uh,
also feel like
Nine.
I have to caveat this because we can't choose seven, and ironically, that would be what I would probably rank this. to split the difference. If I'm thinking about albums of all time and I can't choose seven, I probably have to give it a six. I think from the standpoint of there weren't a lot of great songs, like elite songs. You think of albums that have five or six singles, they have a critical impact. They had an overwhelming response from both fans and critics and airplay. This album
Yeah.
isn't that, but from a personal lens, it's a nine. I mean, there's very few albums that I draw back
Yeah.
to as frequently, have as much of positive associations with. There's probably, I don't know if there's another band I've seen live more than Unfold. Seeing Ben Folds live, and if there's ever a chance I have to see him, I will. So I care about this album a lot, and I think it's fantastic. So if it's just me, it's a nine, but in the broader scheme of things, without being able to choose seven, I think I have to call it a six, which hurts my feelings. Well, that wraps up the
Seems fair.
categories. Anything
Seems fair.
else you want to leave us with as we wrap up here?
No, that's episode one. So if you made it all the way through, this is our first episode, and we'll be doing a lot more.
Yeah,
And we're
subscribe
picking a
if you have any
different album
ideas of
for each
what
episode.
albums
So
you'd
make
want
sure you're
us to
subscribed.
do. Please send them our way. We won't guarantee that we'll do anything, but we'd love to hear from you what albums you think you'd like to hear us talk about. And like Jordan said, this is the first time we've done this, and so we're doing this with very amateurish equipment. I'm sure you noticed the audio isn't as perfect as anything else that you've listened to. We probably should have said that in the beginning,
Yep.
but we're just trying to, if Jordan and I are going to talk about music, we've heard people tell us that they like the way that we talk about music, and thought, why not put it out there and share it with the world and see if other people care. And that would make us happy if we can introduce you to new music that you hadn't heard, or an album that you love and haven't thought about, or just you also really like an album like this and completely disagree with us and think The Ascent of Sand is fantastic, and wouldn't want to hear Luckiest at Your Wedding. So subscribe, follow us on Twitter and Instagram to get updates when we're going to be coming out with new episodes. And otherwise, thanks for listening, and everyone have a good week. Yeah, bye.